Hello everyone, something a little bit different for today's video. I'm not out in the middle of nowhere, but during the summer I did an interview with Chris Townsend, who is a well-known outdoor author and photographer and general spokesperson for a lot of outdoor issues and that sort of thing. And I wanted to try out this format of interviewing people that I would really like to meet and get to know how they feel about things that I think are important and need to be discussed. So the interview is longer than my usual videos, and it's in obviously a completely different format. It's more like a podcast in terms of the way that it's put together, and you could indeed just listen to it without watching the visuals at all if you wished. So it's just something I thought I would try. I will probably do a few more of these from time to time in the future, because there are quite a few people that I'm interested in talking to and getting their opinions on about things that I care about. I have to apologize for the sound because it was a really windy day when I shot this, and I had two clip-on microphones, and this one, which I'm actually wearing right now, which is the better one, had the sound from Chris on it, which is the one that I would rather have survived. But with a lot of chaos that was happening in my life over the summer, I accidentally wiped all of the recordings from the internal memory on the microphone before transferring it to my hard drive. So I have done my best to salvage what reasonable sound I can from the other microphone, but in places it might be slightly difficult to hear what Chris is saying, but it's mostly pretty clear. And the one last thing that I would like to say is we are discussing a few things in this conversation which are controversial, I suppose, for some people. And I'm not going to get into any back and forth discussions in the comments below because I don't find that it's a very useful format for making those kinds of arguments. The arguments are pretty clearly laid out in the video. Feel free to comment, but don't expect me to go into long debates online because it's, yeah, like I said, I just don't find it very useful. So I hope you enjoy the video, and I will be back briefly at the end. So, hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I am very honoured to have an illustrious guest with me because this is the first time that I've done an interview video, and I've been following this man's work on his blog, in his writing, in magazines, in books for quite some time, and he's truly a veteran in the world of outdoor communication. So Chris Townsend, thank you very much for giving me your time today and coming on board.
Thank you.
So Chris is an extremely experienced long distance walker, hiker, skier, author, photographer. Is there anything I've missed?
I don't think so. No, that sounds an awful lot.
Well, it's a very, very full kind of career in the world of outdoor communication and nature communication. I'm very impressed by your list of contributions to the field. It's amazing. But one thing that I'm really interested in when I get to know people is where they're coming from. So I haven't seen an awful lot of writing I've been going through your extensive archive of blogs and a couple of your books, and you don't write an awful lot about your childhood and your kind of inspirations at that time in your life. Would you mind saying a little bit about it?
I have written about it, but only occasionally.
Okay.
Probably in obscure places. Most people don't see it. But my interest came from I was brought up on the edge of the countryside, if you like, but on the Lancashire coast, where it is very flat. The highest hills I ever saw, I think until I was a teenager, were sand dunes. So there were no mountains, but there were forests and the shore, and fields and so on. And my initial interest was in natural history. I went walking to see what birds, animals, plants, trees that I saw. I didn't initially, I wasn't walking for the sake of walking or to go up hills or to do long distance walks. So initially, I'd say it was natural history that attracted me. But then as a teenager, I started going hill walking on school trips and discovered the Lake District, which to me was, like the first seeing the Himalaya or the Alps. I didn't know you could have mountains like this in Britain, and to me then it was like, this is a real wilderness. This is fantastic.
Can you still remember what it felt like to be in the presence of a mountain when you hadn't had that experience before?
Yeah, I think overall it was a surprise. I mean, I knew about them because also I had been inspired to some extent by the books of Arthur Ransom, Swallows and Amazons books, where I was always much more interested in the land-based stuff and the natural history and the camping, not the sailing, in fact, even though that was the key thing with them. But even though he wrote about the hills and the lakes and so on, I had no concept of the size of them. And when I saw them for real, they were so much bigger than I expected. And then I remember I was really surprised to discover that despite their size, you could go up them. And I thought that was amazing. And I knew immediately, we could do this, lots of it, this is great. I like going up these hills. So that, that's sort of how it began as a child. The backpacking came into it. I read lots of books on natural history, but lots of classic exploration books, The Ascent of Everest, Scott in the Antarctic, the Blue Nile, all sorts of things. None of them did I read anything, wow, I'd like to do that. I thought they were exciting adventures and I was impressed by the people who'd done them, but they didn't relate to me in any way. But then the book that I did read, I read John Hillary's Journey Through Britain. And in the 1960s, he'd walked from Land's End to John O'Groats, not on roads, camping out cross country, and he'd written this book about it. And he was a naturalist and a scientist. He wrote regularly for New Scientist magazine. So I read his book, and that caught me. I just read it and thought, that's what I want to do. I want to do a long walk like that, looking at the landscape, the countryside, and the natural history along the way. So that was the book that really got me started. I mean, the first long distance walk I did was the Pennine Way to see how I got on with a 2-week walk. But by the time I finished that, I knew I was something longer. So I did my own Land's End to John O'Groats, inspired by that book. And that, if you like, was the trigger, or the triggers that set me off on everything I've done since.
And how old were you when you first started doing the walking? You're already out of school at that point, I presume.
Well, when I started the hill walking, I was 11, because I was at secondary school and the school organised weekend hill walking trips. I mean, I wasn't doing the more ambitious ones when I was 11, but we were, going to the Peak District and going up Nam Tor, that sort of thing. But really, I started when, at the age of 11. I didn't start the backpacking until my early 20s, because I didn't know about it, how you did it. I did go camping, but it was, go to the Lake District, camp on the Langdale campsite for a weekend, and go up and down the hills. But I didn't carry the camping gear anywhere.
Can you still remember your first wild camp?
I honestly cannot remember. The first wild camp in the hills, the first sort of wild camp came when I was much younger in a a friend of mine at school, his uncle owned a farm somewhere out in Lancashire, and we could go and camp in a disused field. And we did that with an old-fashioned cotton tent. You know, it was a nightmare to lug from the bus stop to the field. We certainly weren't backpacking, but it felt wild.
Yeah.
You know, and we had a campfire. We cooked over the campfire, and we had this tent, which I'm quite sure in any store would have failed instantly. But it was the summer holidays, and it didn't rain enough to be a problem. And I think we were there for about a week. But that was the thing that made me think there was more to camping than being on a site with dozens of other people in tents. It was all organised.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was actually my first experiences of camping were like that. I didn't know anybody who spent time on campsites, so we just, because I grew up in the hills, my friends and I would just go and pitch up for a night in places with tents that would leak like toilet paper if it rained. But it's I didn't know that that most people's idea of camping was paying for someone to let you pitch in their field. So yeah, it always felt kind of adventurous, and then after that, campsites felt a bit tame. Too tame. Great. You've already spoken about that you were into natural history, but so as far as you can remember, was this interest in nature always there? Was it innate?
Yes, I remember it always being there from when I was young enough to notice it. Again, as I say, I think because, you know, being brought up at the edge of the countryside, I mean, literally, there was one side of the house, there were other houses in the road, and the other side there were fields, and then a farm. So those fields and ditches and so on were where I played as a young child. So I was interested, you know, in the trees and everything else. So yeah, it was there from very early on.
I mean, we spoke a little bit before starting the video about it, but was it always about walking and land-based stuff, or have any kind of other ways of accessing wilderness and places like that ever appealed?
Well, it was always land-based.
Yeah.
I mean, it eventually included skiing, ski touring. But I mean, I've never been a water person, so it's never been, you know, canoeing or kayaking or anything. I have crossed many lakes and rivers, but only when they were frozen on skis. Not, but no, it's always land or snow based, if you like.
Okay. Can you recall any early kind of times, anecdotes when you might have made a mistake or misadventure that could have been serious but wasn't?
There probably were some early on, but I was probably too naive to have even realised that, you know, I'd just done something stupid or dangerous and got away with it. Because I can't recollect any from the very early days. Well, no, I can a couple before I'd even started backpacking, which is, you know, when I went on these school trips, we were taught nothing. So we didn't learn navigation at all. And we didn't take much with us. I mean, it was complete trust in the teacher. This is before qualifications came in for mountain leadership. You know, nobody bothered. I mean, you were told to bring a woolly pulley and a hat. You know, that was in some sandwiches. That was about it. It was, you know, nobody checked what you got with your erector. So when I was a student and I'd left school and I still wanted to go hill walking, but I knew a little about navigation, not a lot. I'd never used a compass. I'm not even sure if I'd seen a compass. The teacher probably had one, but I wasn't really aware of necessity. And I did have 2 experiences on Kinder Scout in the Peak District, which back then was an even easier place to get lost than now. There's been a lot of development of paths and restoration of moorland up there. None of that existed then. And on the first occasion, and it was autumn and it was raining, I was with a friend. We got completely lost blundered down in the dark. We didn't have a torch, of course. We'd never thought of carrying a torch. No one ever suggested have a torch. But managed to get ourselves back down and then have to hitchhike back because we'd missed the last train. And we just got soaked. But yeah, we were lucky to get rid of it. So then we went, right, I need a torch. We better find out a bit better about navigating. So we got a torch and a compass. And we went out a few weeks later and repeated the exercise, because then I discovered that torches could switch themselves on in the rucksack and drain the battery. So we had a torch, but it didn't work. And we basically, we got wet again and, managed to get ourselves down. And I think a difference with now is the get ourselves down. The one thing we had picked up was if there was a problem, you had to get yourself out of it. Who else was going to do it? No mobile phones. You couldn't ring up the rescue and say, hey, I'm lost on Kinder Scout and I'm getting cold and wet. Can you come and get me? You couldn't do that. No one was going to notice you missing until the next day. So there's no point sitting there and waiting for something to happen. You had to get yourself out. And I think we did know that. I think it was more also a question of we want to get ourselves out and never tell anybody that this happened again because it's embarrassing, really. But
Yeah, I've been in situations like that and just laughed it off in the early
as long
days.
as you get away with it, it's fine.
Yeah. So tell me about then this, because you did these long walks within the UK, but then you made a big jump overseas, and it seems that really opened your eyes to the potential of the wilderness. So tell us a bit about that.
Well, that was, again, a book. Again, someone who I knew when I was working in the outdoor shop, and that's when I did Lands John the Groats. They gave me 3 months unpaid leave to go and do it. You was in some long distance walking. They'd been to California, and they said, I picked up this book you might be interested in. And it was 1,000 Mile Summer by Colin Fletcher, who I'd never heard of, whose books had never been published in the UK. Well, in fact, he was from Wales. But in the late 50s, he had walked the length of California, where he'd just moved to. Now, in the late 1970s, California was psychologically a lot further away than it is now. Again, because no internet, no smartphones, it was like an almost mythical place. And as for doing a long walk in the wilderness in California, I didn't know where do you begin. I had no idea, but I just knew I wanted to do it. But then, in a outdoor shop, can't remember where, I found a 2-volume trail guide to this thing called the Pacific Crest Trail. There was loads of planning involved, which was very difficult. You had to write letters to organisations in the USA and wait for replies if they replied at all. You couldn't find out much about it other than it was in these guidebooks, which, because they were California published, they made a lot of assumptions about what you would know. But I also, one of the things I picked up from the book was that altitude might be a problem. Not something I'd ever had to think about before, but the Pacific Crest Trail goes up to 14,000 feet and crosses, lots of passes above 13,000 feet. And I thought, how will I cope at those heights? I have no idea. So I did think I should find some idea. So the summer before I was planning to do it, I went to the Pyrenees. So my first walking abroad was actually 2 weeks in the Pyrenees, where I was going above 10,000 feet, 11,000 feet, and I got on fine. So I thought, the altitude won't be a problem, I'll be okay. But that is still, I think, my favourite long distance walk, because it was the one that opened up so much. I mean, the earlier walks had but that was the one that really expanded, my horizons literally as to what was possible and what existed, but also it changed my attitudes to the British Hills, because I walked through all those glorious forests, natural forests, which are fantastic, in the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, and I came back to Britain and thought, where are the trees? Walked around the hills and thought, why aren't the trees? There's no trees here.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I started to actually see what was happening and had happened in our hills.
And on that note, then, I mean, you weren't living in the Cairngorms at that point, were you? But you had been to the Cairngorms.
I've been to the Cairngorms.
So how much of this forest that we see around us was here at that point, or was it?
This just about all we can see here was, because this is Rothy Merker's forest, which was one of the areas, although there was felling here in the Second World War and some planting and so on, but most of it was left untouched. So this is a native Scots pine forest.
But it must have been extremely, I mean, much rarer than it is now, because there's a lot of secondary growth forest, which is coming along at an early stage, but compared to what was back then, this must have been a real standout area.
Yes. I mean, there's been an awful lot since. I mean, into Wildland Limited taking over Glenfeshie, which still had a lot of ancient pines, but no young ones. And that is now regenerating wildly. It's a completely different place to what it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago. But you've also got Abernethy Forest, which was taken over by the RSPB, and again, who have allowed it to regenerate, done some planting where there were no trees, not plantations, but a few trees here and there for seed source. So, and there's other examples, smaller estates where things, are happening.
We'll come back to this because it is later, but I want to go back briefly to, how did you find it when you were on the Pacific Crest Trail? I know you had spent, or was it a problem before that actually, in the UK, spending so much time on your own, because you were walking solo on the Land's End to John O'Groats, right? And then most of the time on the Pacific Crest. Was it difficult?
No. It's one of the most difficult questions I get asked. When you say, weren't you lonely? How did you cope with being alone? Because I didn't have to. I didn't feel lonely. And that may go back to when I was talking about as a child, interested in natural history. I used to go out the weekends and wander around the Thornbury Pine Woods on my own. And I suppose I got used to being in nature by myself early on. And this was just an extension of that. Instead of a day, it was a week or a month. But,
Have you ever got lonely that you can think of?
Lonely? No.
I mean, in the outdoors?
No. I mean, there's a point on almost every long distance walk where I've got bored, but that's usually been because it's a bit of the walk which is a bit urbanised or industrialised, and which if you weren't doing a continuous end-to-end walk, you'd skip. Because if you like, it wasn't outdoorsy enough, there wasn't enough nature to catch my interest. But I didn't feel lonely then. I just thought I want to get through this bit as fast as possible and get back to the interesting stuff.
Yeah, great. Still kind of on the theme of being alone, have you ever thought about what's the longest time you've gone without any direct human contact?
Yeah. The longest time was I did a walk south-north through the Yukon Territory in Canada, and at one point in that I was out for 10 days without seeing anybody or any sign of anybody. There wasn't even a plane went overhead. But I only realised that when it ended. And then I thought back and thought, I haven't spoken to anybody for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I worked out that, oh yeah, not since I left, wherever it was the place I'd been when I set off on this stretch. So yeah, so 10 days.
Yeah, because I read that in a book. I can't remember who wrote the book, but it was about solitude a couple of years ago, and I had never really thought about it before. In terms of that, most people have never been separated from direct human contact for more than 24 hours or even, and how actually relatively unusual it is, and I never really gave it a second thought. But when you look back on things,
yeah,
it's like, oh, okay, and that was all right. So a bit more philosophical. What is wilderness?
I think it's a number of different things. You can have a definition based on the naturalness in the sense of nothing human made in an area. But I think you can also have it as a feeling. I mean, I would say this feels wild here. Now, this is not wilderness in any sort of official definition. I mean, in the USA, we have a Wilderness Act which defines what is wilderness and what isn't. This would not count as wilderness under the US Wilderness Act. But if you take it as a feel, then this feels wild. So in that sense, it can both be and not be wilderness. You often hear people say, on the one hand, people say there are no wilderness areas in the UK. There is no wilderness in the UK. And you can always find online in outdoor magazines stuff about the great wilderness of places in the UK, where wilderness is used to mean wild rather than a definition. And I think you get degrees anyway. Glenfeshie is wilder than it was because of the regeneration. So it's closer to being, if you like, the definition of wilderness than it used to be. But it was wild at the beginning of that. So it's a process. So I think it's very difficult to pin down what it is.
We were in Norway last year, and in one museum they seemed to have come up with their own definition of wilderness, and they had it on a map how they're losing their wilderness over the decades, and they say it's got to be at least 5 kilometers away from any kind of identifiable human influence on the land. Whereas if you look in the dictionary, because I was surprised when I looked in the dictionary for the definition of wilderness, it doesn't really have one. It just says comes from an old word, wilderness, I think, which is just a place which doesn't have any people. It's just wild animals.
Place of wild animals.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you're a big advocate for the restoration of ecosystems. How do you feel about the word rewilding? Because it's become quite loaded in the last few years.
I mean, it's been loaded, I think, from the beginning. But yes, I mean, overall, I quite like it because I think it goes beyond the concept of conservation, because conservation, implies keeping it as it is, conserving it. So it's to do with protectionism, which is obviously needed. That's where you've got to start. It's not destroying anything anymore, but then not doing anything with it other than keeping it static. Whereas rewilding is about restoration. I mean, I would prefer the words restoration or regeneration, partly because rewilding has become so emotive. Because you go back to Rewilding, again, is an American term. And the Americans who came up with it were talking about large predators. They were talking about restoring particularly wolves and bears to wilderness areas and national parks that used to have them that didn't have them. And that's what they saw. So they were talking about areas that we would regard as incredibly wild already, but had lost these big predators. And then it sort of spread to become more, restoration, regeneration. But I also think, which I think is important, it has the concept of minimal interference. And so the difference between, as in Glenfeshie, reduce the deer numbers drastically, that's the interference, because otherwise the forest won't go because there's no natural predators, but then stop, as opposed to the estates that say, right, put up a big stop fence to keep the deer out, plant lots of trees, and then we'll have a new forest very quickly. I would say that's not rewilding. It's better than doing nothing, in the sense of it's better than leaving the deer there to ensure that no forest grows at all. But it's not rewilding because the interference, I'd say, is too great for it to be true rewilding.
Yeah. And how do you feel about the idea of predator reintroductions here?
Well, I think any reintroduction, any rewilding has to be done working with local people. It's not something that should be imposed from above. And that means there's a big public relations exercise involved. At the moment, I would say there's a very strong case for reintroducing lynx, because we've got the forests where they would live, and we've got a surplus of deer which they eat. I can't see any real objection to that. Wolves is more problematic because of how much suitable habitat is there. Wolves roam over vaster areas than lynx. That said, there are much more urbanised countries in Europe now that have got wolves back. There's also, though, much more of a PR case needed for wolves for it possibly to be accepted, because they've been demonised for so long, and you have to overcome that weight of the history of wolves, which lynx don't really have. Partly because when there were lynx, they're hardly ever seen anyway. I mean, they're very secretive. They're not animals you see bounding around at night and so on. And the other one, essentially, which is bears. I can't remember how long ago it was, but one survey that interested and amused me was a general public survey, and wolves were really totally unacceptable, which didn't surprise me. Bears weren't. And I just thought, this is because people don't know about bears here. And I thought, you know what, all the long walks I did in the USA, a lot of them were in bear country where you had to take precautions. They were also in wolf country. I saw wolves. You never needed to take precautions about wolves. Wolves were not going to be a problem. Bears could be a problem, so you needed to think about it. And I thought, no, actually bears would be a lot more problem.
The statistics speak for themselves, don't they?
But they don't have the history, being demonised the way that wolves do. So they're more acceptable.
On the issue of the I did see in one of your blogs, or maybe, yeah, I think it was in a blog post about the commodification of the hills. So using it for, I mean, I'm younger than you, but I still come from a generation which is uneasy with kind of the whole, hey, look at me, and look at how amazing everything I'm doing is. And I do notice a lot of, especially younger people who are doing this sort of thing on YouTube or in blogs or whatever, who will go out and put themselves in questionable circumstances just for the sensationalism of it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I think the worst thing with that is that it's encouraging others to do the same. And obviously, anyone who's experienced is not going to do it. So the people who are going to be encouraged by it are going to be people who don't know any better. And these people are basically saying to them, hey, you should go and camp on this mountain summit in a big storm. It's wonderful. It's an exciting adventure. You know, you should pitch your tent on the edge of this cliff and get this great Instagram photo. And the people who do it, as I say, don't know when it's wise or not to do so. So I think that's, you know, the worst thing is it's setting up, and the idea this is what being in the outdoors is about. You know, it's doing these things that are risky without an explanation of the risks. You know, without anything to say, this is what's involved, this is what you should do. But I think this comes the whole question here of education. You know, the people who have to deal with the problems resulting in this are the mountain rescue teams. And they are under great pressure, as we know in some areas, because the number of rescues has gone up so much that for a volunteer team, it's getting out of hand because it's becoming almost full time. But they're not full time, they're volunteers, they have jobs. And some of them are made clear. I mean, one report I read recently about rescues in the Lake saying the team leader thought all of these rescues were avoidable. You know, so they weren't someone tripped and broke their leg. You know, that's not avoidable, they have to be rescued. But ones where it is people whose, you know, tent blew down, or who got cold and wet and were frightened, so they called the rescue and didn't know the way off, or couldn't navigate because they were using Google Maps on their phone. You know, a whole host of things. And they're the sort of people who will be influenced by the people online doing reckless things to think we can do that too. And quite often, like I said about me going up Kinder Scout and not knowing, they don't know what they don't know. You know, they don't even know there's anything to know about this. And I think, you know, this is a growing problem because there is a limit. I mean, for mountain rescue, there's a limit to how much they can do. And some of the teams are making it clear that it's getting near, you know, breaking point. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because the thing with education is, well, there's more information out there and it's more easily available than ever before. You know, all the organisations, mountain rescue teams, mountain rescue organisations, outdoor centres, people like me are always pumping out advice and information and so on online. So it's there. And I don't know, and it's obviously not getting through to an awful lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a wider question of the kind of flagging and using AI constructively or something to flag content, which is...
I wonder, I think this, yes, some of the content sites, providers could be thinking about, does this need some sort of warning? But I think with some of these people, the warning would be, that's something I want to look at. You know, it could work negatively. But I wonder, at what point does the education need to start, because now I my children having long left school. I have no idea these days about what happens, in schools. But when I was in primary school, which of course is a very, very long time ago, but one of the things we did was countryside code, and we did it regularly, and we went on nature walks, and it was, and it was low level. It was countryside, not hills and mountains, but it was about, closing gates behind you, but also not dropping litter, not damaging plants or trees and so on. Someone who doesn't realise that tramping, 4 people, 4 abreast, tramping through this wildflower meadow has just destroyed it, because they don't think, but they're the people you want to get through to. And in some cases, this is one of the task rangers have, of whom there's probably nowhere near enough, is simply talking to people. Talking to people about why they should put that campfire out, why they should clear up their litter, why camping here is not actually, a good idea. All the rest of it.
Yeah, I was presented with an example of that quite recently. Actually, I had an article about my loch snorkeling trips on UK hill walking a few weeks ago, and someone put in the comments, you haven't thought about biosecurity. And that was exactly a case of complete ignorance. Of course, I've heard about biosecurity in other contexts, but it had never occurred to me that the waters in these, so high in the catchment area was so pristine in a lot of cases, and might not have the same kind of invasive plant or bacteria or viral species which might exist in other places that haven't been protected so much. And as a result, I've started disinfecting my all of my neoprene, all of my gear between trips, which is kind of, and I realized exactly what you just said, at that connection, that it's just kind of, people aren't thinking, but as soon as you point it out, you might initially kind of get angry and think, oh yeah, get off your high horse and leave me alone. But then it kind of sinks in slowly. It's like, oh, wait a second, actually, I do have a responsibility here. Especially if I'm promoting it.
Yeah, exactly that. And of course, with that example, wild swimming has become so popular in recent years that must be a growing problem.
Yeah.
Because there must be plenty of places that didn't see a swimmer from one year to the next.
Yeah.
But are now seeing people swimming regularly. Certainly, as you know, there's plenty of stuff online of people swimming in mountain lochans.
Yeah. I've seen you quoting John Muir a few times in your writings and stuff. I hope you'll forgive the kind of comparison, but I see you as a bit of a 21st century John Muir type character. This advocate for the wild, spent so much time of your life out in the wild. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're in your 70s now. Is that correct? Do you? I mean, I can't imagine myself being as active at camping and walking when I get to that age. Hopefully, I'll be wrong. But do you foresee a time when you might have to hang up your boots?
I mean, I accept that it's possible, but
It's not creeping up on you yet.
I don't foresee it. No, it's I mean, because I will keep going as long as I can. I mean, I'm aware, obviously, that some of the things I did when I was much younger, I either wouldn't be able to do now, or would take me an awful lot longer to do now. That there are limitations that come as you get older, but not great ones so far.
Are you still planning future multi-week, multi-month
hikes?
Multi-week, certainly. I haven't planned any multi-month runs for like a few years. Quite a few years. I think the last multi-month run I did was Pacific Northwest Trail in 2010, so 15 years ago.
Okay. And what is it that you're thinking about doing next?
I'm thinking about doing more and different walks in Scotland to see more parts of Scotland that I've somehow missed. I mean, I've done 2 long distance walks in Scotland, which were the Munros and Tops in one walk and the Scottish Watershed. But the Scottish Watershed, oddly enough, made me aware of how much I hadn't seen. Because even though I'd done the Munros and Tops and lots of other water in Scotland, there was so much of the watershed that was completely new. And it made me think, there are other places that are completely new that, I've bypassed or haven't seen, or other ways between hills that I've never done because they didn't fit into the other walks. So that's my current thinking.
Excellent. Well, once again, thank you so much for coming out and taking time out on this windy but pleasant Saturday afternoon. And yeah, I wish you the best with the plans.
Thank you.
So there you have it. There was my conversation with Chris Townsend, whose books and articles I have read over the years, and it was very interesting to meet the man in the flesh. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. I will be back in a couple of weeks with something else, and in the meantime, I hope you have a lovely time. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, and I'll see you soon. I hope you're having a nice autumn so far. This week has been lovely. Toodaloo.